Hello, everyone, and welcome to the stream. We have with us Brandon. He is going to be chatting with us about Commander, and more specifically, we're going to be talking about kind of how to get into Commander, or Commander 101, so to speak. Uh, Brandon, how long have you been playing Commander?
So since mid March is really just it. So I'm at the basically the 2 month mark.
Nice. And so I've been playing. I think I'm at a year now. I think I've just passed a year, which is fine.
That sounds right.
Yeah. But uh, with that, so I've been kind of heckling Brandon to play Commander for a long time. Brandon and I think we both came from Yu Gi Oh! Back in the day. And
Mhm.
so we both really enjoy card games. We both like the strategy. We both love deck building. And I think I got into it because of another friend of mine named Bowser. He got me into it, and then I heckled Brandon long enough for him to get into it. But then that got us into talking about how do you get into Commander or how do you get into Magic the Gathering. And then Brandon had the great idea to, hey, he goes, hey, make a video about that. And so he
Mhm.
made this nice notes list for us to go through on how to get started in Commander. And so I think the main purpose of this, at least for me, is I want to be able to, by the end of this conversation, I hope to have broach people's, or at least answer a lot of people's base questions if you're new to Magic the Gathering or want to hop into Commander from another format. And I think we're going to cover, let's see, kind of rules of the game. I think deck building a little bit, and then playing the game. I think are kind of the three highlights we have here. Um, but hopefully, at the end of this conversation, this should maybe give you the nudge or the confidence to just hop in. Um, I know I got a lot of my friends in just by I actually went and bought them a Commander Precon, and I sat us down one night and was like, "Hey, I'm gonna teach you guys how to play this game," and just we just ran with it. Uh, but that's kind of my goal. And Brandon's here as he's got that brand new, fresh perspective. So I think we can all kind of just walk along together because I only have a year experience. Brandon's 2 months in, but I think still having someone there that is also kind of new, um, I think it'll maybe help ease in that transition. Or, like I said, I think I just want to give people the confidence to hop into this game. It's a really fun game. I just want to share it with everybody. Everybody should play it. Everybody should play it.
Yeah.
That's kind of my
I
stance.
totally agree. And just to kind of echo a little bit of what Mike said, the that was really the fun part was Mike told us, hey, for my bachelor party, it was actually right before you got married. You said, hey, I'm gonna get everybody pre-cons. We're gonna learn how to play this game, and so we're just gonna sit down. We're gonna play a game or two, and then if you guys like it, we can play a little bit more. But if not, we'll play something else. We'll play D&D or something. And so I'm very much a deck builder. That's my favorite part of any game that I've ever played, and I mean, we probably have a decade worth of experience in Yu-Gi-Oh, and so
Yeah.
playing other deck builders and other competitive card games, that is definitely something we're not a stranger to, and so that's something that I think has surprised other people that I've played with, and in the time since we started playing, or since I started playing with you anyway, is that I'm like, hey, I'm like 9 games in, so go a little easy on me, and then I sit down and start going, and I'm like, and people are like, wait, what do you mean you've only been playing 9 games? Like, you're playing pretty well. And I'm like, well, I've played other games that are very similar. And so um, a lot of these questions, or a lot of the things that we're going to talk about, are really just things that I was like, hey, this is different from what I'm used to, or hey, this is a different mechanic, or what does this word mean, that kind of stuff. So these are questions that maybe I ask Mike throughout the process, and maybe in my research of trying to learn the game, I didn't find a great resource, or I had to ask follow-up questions to get a better understanding. And so that's kind of what we're hoping to accomplish with this video. Is Mike is kind of a presenter for kind of bridging that gap of, hey, okay, you've heard of Commander, but let's talk about the basic stuff. Let's talk about what is a land, you know what I mean, and just go from there. So
Yeah.
I'm really excited, and I'm happy to help however I can.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that because I think our other reasoning too for getting this set up was because uh, when trying to get you interested or like answer your questions, I think I sent you some YouTube videos that other people have done before, but I realized that a lot of those videos were like 3, 4 years old, and some of them, I think a couple of them I sent you were actually a little outdated,
Yeah.
just with rules or some rule changes and things like that. So I think just having an updated two, current players fresh to the format, I think that's gonna really help people get into this thing.
Well,
So
and there may even be some things in here that an experienced player goes, "Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about that." And that may be a little bit further on once we're talking about deck building or something. But and that's where some of our extended experience in other games can come in handy.
yeah, and I mean honestly, oh, not honestly, but if you have questions or anyone hops in the middle of this, just ask a question in the chat and I'll do my best to answer them. I'm not going to say I know everything there is to know, but this is Commander 101. And if there's anything I am good at, it's being brand new to something and figuring it out. So that's what we're going to do. So I think starting this off, what is Commander? So on here, so there's two names for Commander. There's Elder Dragon Highlander and Commander. They are both the same thing. It's just two different names for them. It is a format of Magic the Gathering. Magic the Gathering has several different formats. They all use the same Magic the Gathering cards, but they each have different rules. They have different ban lists. Certain formats can only use cards from the past like few sets or few years. But Commander is, in my opinion, the best because you can use just about any card that Magic the Gathering has ever printed. And I think that is fantastic. I think that's so much fun. So you don't really have to worry about like a ban list coming out every 6 months or so. There is a ban list, but it's pretty irrelevant, which is great. But I just want to skim over a little bit, just skimming over Magic the Gathering in general. If you don't know how to play Magic the Gathering, I highly advise you download the app Arena, Magic the Gathering Arena. It teaches you how to play the game. It teaches you how to play Magic the Gathering, which is like the base mechanics of Magic, because that's what Commander does. It teaches you what lands do. It teaches you what sorceries, instances, all the different card types. The app has a great tutorial and it walks you through everything. It's a great little app that takes. How long did it take you to walk through it, Brandon?
I'd say I probably got through it in maybe a straight hour and a half or so of just actually going through it.
Yeah, it doesn't take a whole lot of time. At the core, uh, at the core gameplay, Magic's not really hard. You use your mana to cast spells. Make sure you have the right color lands to cast set spells. So I'm kind of going down this list here. So we have these bullet points, and Brandon can keep me on track if I get sidetracked. Yeah. So we talked a little bit about land and mana and what that is. So Commander itself, in Commander, the difference between it and other formats is I'm going to try not to compare too much. I'm going to try to focus just on Commander. So when you play Commander, you make a 100 card deck. It is a singleton format, which means you can only have one copy of a card in your deck outside of basic lands. Basic lands are the only cards you can have multiples of. And one of those cards has to be a legendary creature. Basic land. Boom. There you go.
Basically.
You can have as many of those as you want. But what makes Commander fun is you pick a legendary creature. So this is just one I have on hand. But so this is a legendary creature. This can be... Ooh, that light's bad. Anyway, it's a legendary creature. You can pick any legendary you want. And that's your Commander. And that has a special zone outside of your deck. So your deck will have 99 cards. Your Commander's the 100th card. And you set it outside. That's your commander, and you build your whole deck around this commander. So if your commander likes to draw cards, your deck's probably going to be drawing cards too. It's going to be floating around that formula. Not to get too deep down the rabbit hole, but deck building itself is like a whole other concept, whole other thing. And then when you pick your commander, you look at the colors that your commander has. So the one I showed, I think, was it was green and white. So that means you can only have green and white cards in your deck. You cannot have any black lands or anything like that. You can only have green and white. Which is why, I mean, they have dual lands, but dual lands are named lands. So like, I can't think of one off the top of my head, but like one of the gates, like one of the gate cards is a dual land. You can only have one copy of that because it's not a basic land. So kind of have to, there you go.
Eroded Canyon.
So Eroded Canyon is a land. It's a desert, not a basic. You can have that one land in your deck. The more colors you have, the more options you have in building your deck, but that's kind of the basis of it. So you have your commander, you have your 99 cards. Only basics are your double. There are 4 players. Commander is a multiplayer game. So you play with 4 players up to, I think, 6 or 8. I think it's 6. I normally just do 4. 4 players is the perfect amount of people. You don't really want to play with any more than that. But a 4-player pod, they're called pods. Everyone has 40 life. You go around just like in any other game, and you're trying to bring everyone's life total from 40 all the way down to 0. It's kind of the gist of it. The rest of Magic rules are the same. If you don't have a deck to draw from, you die. The only other option you have is Commander has another rule called Commander Damage. So your commander, if it's a creature, say, like I have a commander who's Godzilla. Godzilla's my commander. If a commander deals 21 damage to a player, they die. 21 damage, 21 commander damage, and you're out. But I have to do that to every player, which I really like because the life gain decks, you can get up to like an astronomical number, and it can be really hard to like bring them back down. But if you're just hitting them with your commander, it doesn't matter how much life they have. If you took 21 damage of someone's commander, you're dead. And it has to be that specific commander. So you're actually tracking everyone's commander damage on you. So it's not total commander, just that one particular commander has to deal that much damage. Same rules as the rest of Magic. You start with 7 cards in your hand, and in a multiplayer format, you actually draw one if you're going first. So you draw your 7. If you go first, you draw, and then you have 8. You have your 8 cards to play with. Same thing with all the other rules are the same. You can only have 7 cards in your hand by the end of your turn, or you have to discard down to 7. Let's see. If I'm rambling, feel free to back me up.
No, you're fine.
But
you're fine. The next one that I had on here was on like a mulligan rule. And this is pretty unique to Magic from my experience in playing other card games, is playing with a 100 card deck, and if you draw just a whole bunch of cards that don't really synergize, or maybe they're really high mana value or something like that, then you do have the ability to mulligan.
Yeah, and so mulligan is just what you said. You get to like just shuffle your hand back into your deck and draw fresh cards. Coming from Yu-Gi-Oh, this was unheard of. Yu-Gi-Oh, you just sucked it up.
Amazing if you can. Yeah.
But in Commander, the mulligan rule is you shuffle your deck, you draw your 7, you look at them. If you like it, you say cool. If you don't like it, you get 1 free mulligan. So you can shuffle it back in, draw 7 fresh cards. If you still don't like that, if you still didn't draw any land, then you go into, I guess, what you call a deficit. So after you do your free mulligan, you shuffle your hand back in. So on your second mulligan, you'll draw 7, say you like it, but now you have to take one card and put it at the bottom of your deck. So you're going to start the game with 6 cards. It's not that big of a deal. I've won several games mulliganing down to 6, but it keeps going down. So you mulligan again. If you still don't like it on that one, on the third one, you go down to 5, 4. Man, if you're going past 5, just put the deck up. It's not for you. Pick a different deck.
Yep.
Like
you didn't build a good deck.
Yeah, yeah. Or you just had your luck is terrible. But yeah, mulligans are really, really fun. I think they give, because it's a singleton format, and it's 100 cards, so you can draw bad. Just statistically speaking, you can draw bad, and so I really like that rule. The mulligan rule officially has changed over the years, but the one I just described, I don't know the name of it off the top of my head, but that's the rule. If you get one free one, after that, every other mulligan, you just go down to 1.
Yeah.
My rule of thumb.
And I've played. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I'll just say my rule of thumb is I usually just go down to 5, and that's it.
Just take your hand.
I just take my hand at 5 and be like, we'll just screw it. But anyway, what were you gonna say?
I've played several tables since we started playing that have been very casual players, and they're not trying to win at all costs or anything like that. And so they've been very flexible with mulligan rules, and they've said just go until you have a hand that works. And they've kind of added the caveat of don't keep going until you get your god hand. Just go until you have something that works. And so they're what they're saying there is don't keep drawing until you have the perfect hand that can go infinite on turn 2. They're just basically trying to say, hey, limit your, just try not to abuse the optional rule, but just make sure that you have a hand that's workable, kind of thing. If you're in a 3-color deck, try to get all 3 colors in your opening hand, that kind of thing. So
yeah, and I want to touch on that too. Commander itself it's a very casual format. You may even see when you go online, people, EDH is the acronym for Elder Dragon Highlander. So you may see people like, hey, here's an EDH game. And then you might see something called CEDH, which is an acronym for Competitive Elder Dragon Highlander. Competitive is what it is. Like you're playing to win, you go hard, the games last maybe 6 turns, maybe 6 to 8, maybe. But from what we're coming from, just Commander in general, it's a very casual format. There's a lot of politicking, kind of how you said the mulligan rules, especially in someone's house, not even just at a local game store, can just be, in a pod of wherever you're playing. People can talk about it, like you said, where they're like, hey, just get a good hand, or just get a playable hand, I should say. I think that's very important. I think that's almost the spirit of Commander, is to be very casual. You're there to have fun. In general, you want everyone to play the game and do the thing that they're there to do. I think that's why I like the game so much. You can talk with your opponents. There's a lot of, we call it politicking during the game. There's no hard, fast rule for it. Some people go into pods and they're like, hey, I don't want to play anything high power. Like, I just bought this deck off the store shelf. It's like, I'm just going to play this. And people are like, oh, okay, cool. Like, we'll also play something right out of the box. And, you can have fun that way. Or you can be like, hey, this deck has some infinite combos in it. Like, I'm playing something kind of spicy. And your pod can be like, hey, I don't really want to play that. Like, do you have anything else? Like, it's a very, I don't know, it's a very social game. It's very, I don't know. I just really like that aspect to it. So like your example of the mulligan thing is fantastic. It's just nice to have an official mulligan rule for some, because there are some people that, like you said, do kind of abuse that. They are looking for that god hand, and they'll just keep shuffling and shuffling until they get their god hand. So it's nice to always have a default of like, hey, let's just use the official rules. Like, let's just use that, because there's nothing wrong with the official rules.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and kind of to echo that even a little bit more, we'll talk about like power level and kind of how to look at power level of different decks and that kind of stuff as we kind of get a little bit deeper into that. But that is something that's kind of a that can be a little bit of a learning curve of um, how and why to upgrade decks, or do you just grab a precon and start playing? And a lot of the modern precons are perfectly playable. They're perfectly fine to take off the shelf and start going.
Oh yeah.
And there's several of them that it's like, hey, you can take 10 cards out and put 10 more cards back in, and they're gonna be they're gonna be just as powerful as a custom deck kind of thing. So
And there's all
there's a
kinds
lot of
of YouTube
really cool stuff.
channels that are
Yeah,
dedicated just to that of, hey, here's
yeah,
10 cards. Slot that in. Your deck is now
absolutely,
competitive.
absolutely. Perfect. So kind of jumping back to the some of the like rules that we are going over. So we talked about mulligan. The next one is kind of going over like the phases of a turn and kind of going through what does a normal turn look like.
Yeah. So this is very similar to any other format of Magic, from my understanding. So um, you start off with your draw phase, and then you go into, well, sorry, let me back up. So sorry. It actually goes untap, upkeep, draw. So untap, you untap all your lands, all your permanents that are allowed to untap. Upkeep, you do anything that something says during your upkeep, and then you draw. Then you go into your main phase. Main phase is where you're going to cast all your spells, bring out all your creatures, things of that nature. Then you'll proceed to the combat phase. Combat phase, you'll turn those cards sideways and start smacking people. After combat, there's a second main phase. And same thing as the first main phase, you cast your spells, bring out maybe a couple more creatures. If you didn't play a land in your first main phase, you can play it here. And then you go to your end step. And your end step is going to check and see if your hand has, more than 8 cards, or if there's any other triggers that happen at the end step. So that's a normal phase. And then everyone's going to do it. And by the time it gets back to you, that's considered a turn. So 4 people are going to go through this: untap, upkeep, draw, main phase 1, combat, main phase 2, end phase. Very similar for people who come from Yu-Gi-Oh! It's pretty similar, with the draw, standby, main 1, battle, main 2, end phase. Um,
Mhm.
so those
Yeah,
are,
coming from Yu-Gi-Oh, all of that felt very similar.
yes. I think the only, well, no, Yu-Gi-Oh had it too. Anyone who plays like the Yu-Gi-Oh mobile game, uh, if you have like the setting where you have like a trap card or like a spell card set, and like, hey, do you want to activate this now? Do you want to activate this now? How about now? Uh,
Yep.
Commander's kind of like that too,
Yeah.
where it's like, hey, you can, do your instances and do
Mm.
if they have any interaction, because a lot of people are like, hey, I would like to proceed to combat, and you ask, and this is called priority. I actually don't have this on here, but priority happens. So the turn player has priority. They always have it. After they cast a spell like an instant, or they want to go to the next phase, you have the other players have a chance to respond, and it goes in clockwise order. Um, and this is where some politics can happen. People can talk, but the order still has to go. The next person, they say, it's like, I have no response. Third, fourth, and so on until it comes back to you to resolve. Most people in Commander don't do it that way. Most of the time, if you're casting spells or doing stuff, it's just, you're just going. You're not really checking for priority or anything like that, which is totally fine. You just have to be respectable when someone says, hey, hang on a second. I have a response. And then you can be like, okay, well, let's go through priority, and everyone will do the priority thing, and then it'll get to them, and they're like, hey, I would like to counter that or
Yeah.
do something.
And kind of just to add on to that just a teeny bit, because I agree with that 100%. If you are holding up mana and you have a response, a lot of times if you're holding a counter spell or you're holding destruction or something, it's kind of on you to watch the turn player and kind of be watching them and going, okay, what are they doing? When are they doing it? That's the thing I want to stop, and kind of be ready to say, okay, on summon, and be ready to kind of gently interrupt them and say, hey, this is where I want to in response, and kind of interject on that.
Yeah, and there's timing rules and Magic, and that gets kind of into the nitty gritty of it. But yes, it is up to the person holding that response or holding that mana up. It's up to you to figure out and to know the rules on when you're allowed to respond and when you want to get rid of something or need to get rid of something. And that all just takes place naturally within the course of a turn and phases and things of that nature. Um, what else did you have here?
So we've got quite a bit of other stuff kind of going through this. So you mentioned, I'm kind of skipping a little bit, but I think this is actually kind of important. You mentioned the untap upkeep draw. I think it's actually important here to talk about tapping and untapping, and maybe summoning sickness and haste as well.
Yeah. So, and again, these are if you know how to play Magic, this is like your bread and butter. But in Magic, you play a land like that mountain Brandon showed earlier, and you tap it. And tapping simply means taking the card from vertical to horizontal, which turning it sideways, and you're getting a mana out of it. And you're casting a spell. Most of the time, you're going to cast a creature. Most creatures, when you bring them out, they have something called summoning sickness, which means they come out and you are not allowed to tap them for abilities if they have a tap ability, and you're not allowed to tap them or use them for attacking that turn. However, they can still be used as blockers. So you bring out your 2/2 goblin. He can't attack, he can't do anything, but he's out there. You have a blocker and you pass. So when it goes to somebody else, say they bring out a creature, but they have haste. That creature has the keyword haste on it. Haste means it can tap, it can use its tap abilities and or it can attack that turn that it's summoned. So they may be able to go immediately into creature, proceed to combat. My creature has haste, or something else is giving it haste, and he swings at you. You can still use your summoning sick creature to block,
Mhm.
and that's pretty bread and butter commander stuff. There's a whole bunch of other
Yeah.
rulings with artifact vehicles. I know the mounts just came out, uh, and there's like some nitty gritty rules on that where you are allowed to tap a summon sick creature for other card abilities. Uh, we don't really need to get into that right now, but for the most part, if you bring out a creature, if it doesn't have the word haste on it, you cannot tap it and you cannot attack with it.
Yep. Well said. And that was something that has taken me a little bit of time to get used to, is because in Yu-Gi-Oh, it's very much get out five monsters, swing out, try to end the game kind of thing. And so,
Yep.
whereas in Magic, it's because of summoning sickness, you do have to be a little bit more strategic, and because you have a a resource system where, okay, you can play one land a turn, so that means that on turn one you have one mana available to your land. Then on turn two you have two mana available. Then on turn three you have three mana available. And there's 150 ways to get around that. But and to get more, and if you miss a land drop, then you're going to have less, and that kind of stuff. And so we'll talk about stuff like ramp. We'll talk about stuff like artifacts. We'll talk about mana dorks. We'll talk about all of that here in a bit, maybe next time. But basically, there's, like I said, there's 150 ways to get around that, but that was something that took me a little bit to kind of wrap my head around. Was, oh, I can't just get something out and attack. I have to get something out, and it has to make it all the way around the table before I can attack with it. So it may die as a blocker. Um, it may get removed by another spell or something. Something else. There's all kinds of stuff that can happen to it. So there's a lot of protection. There's a lot of planning ahead that needs to go into, okay, when do you play your creatures? What are you getting out of a creature on the turn that you play it? Just different things like that. So, and we'll probably talk about enter the battlefield effects. We'll talk about tap effects. We'll talk about all that kind of stuff. But summoning sickness does play a big role in a lot of those things. Of okay, this is a really big, strong attacker because I want to end the game this turn. Yeah, well, you can't end the game this turn if you're summoning it this turn, that kind of stuff. And so that kind of gives everybody a chance to respond to what you're doing, kind of through summoning sickness. So, and like most keywords with haste, there are ways to give your creatures haste in basically any color. And so either through artifacts like the boots or through various different effects. So, and we'll get to that here in a little bit, but it's definitely interesting to kind of see how those play a role. And that's still a bad habit of mine, is I'll swing and attack with something and then I'll forget to tap it after I'm done attacking. And so that's just little bitty rules that are something to remember of, hey, you attacked with that, remember it's tapped, so it can't block. It's exhausted after fighting a battle. It needs to rest until your next turn, where you can untap, upkeep, draw.
Yeah, and I think I skipped that too, but after a creature attacks, if you do attack with it, if it's tapped, it can no longer block. So I like that metaphor of it's tired, it needs to rest until the next round.
Yeah, and of course there's a keyword for that too.
Yeah. There is a lot to Commander, but luckily, once you kind of know certain definitions, and a lot of the cards are printed with the definitions on them, and the things we're talking about, like haste and keywords, are like vigilance. Usually, those words are like right after the name of the type of creature. So underneath where it says like legendary creature, there's that white box. Most keywords are those first few words, and they usually have a definition next to them, so people kind of know what it means, which is really nice. That's one thing I really like about Commander, is reading the card really does explain the card. And luckily, if you're in a pot of, 3 other people, like you can ask them the question, like, hey, can I do this? Does this work? Da 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 da. And every person I've talked with, always been super cool, always walk me through it, because I think at the end of it, we all just want everyone to enjoy the game and play it to the best of its ability. I do see we have a few viewers, and so I wanted to reiterate in case they didn't hear earlier. If you have a question of anything we're going over, please feel free to ask, and we will answer it to the best of our ability. Next on here, yeah. The stack.
Real quickly, this is something that you mentioned earlier. Was actually whenever you mentioned you can use any legendary creature as your commander, and then you kind of talked about doing commander damage, and you had said, as long as your commander can attack. And I think that's actually an interesting point to go over the difference between planeswalkers and creatures.
Yeah, so for the most part, like 99% of commanders out there are legendary creatures, and they can always be a commander. However, there are cards called planeswalkers. They're just a different kind of card, and there's a special text at the bottom of planeswalkers that says it can be your commander. It can be used to play your commander. So those are commanders that they work just like the legendary creature, but it's planeswalker. And most planeswalkers can't attack. They just have really neat abilities that you can do as soon as they're brought out. So they can be very powerful, they can be really strong, but you're not going to be really doing commander damage with them. So it's kind of a toss-up on just the strategy to it. It's what makes them fun. I have a couple. I say a couple. I think I have one commander deck that's a planeswalker, and it's not going to win through commander damage, but it's still a fun commander to use because planeswalkers are fun, and it makes the game much more interesting because can attack your commander that way, because planeswalkers are basically another, if you want to get into like some nerdy lore to it, like we players are planeswalkers, um, and like the Magic the Gathering universe kind of thing. So when we play a planeswalker, it's like having another one on the field, so creatures can attack them. So that's how most of those commanders will die, is that they'll just straight up attack your commander directly. Where most legendary creatures are just, they have to be gotten rid of on just generic removal, like you would any other creature. But that's a good point. Yeah, not all decks are going to have commander damage to take out other players.
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of an interesting thing is like whenever if we're playing a game of Commander and I say, "Hey, Michael, I want to attack you." You can choose to just let the attack go through and keep all your monsters. Like you don't have to sacrifice monsters to protect your life points. And so that's kind of there's an interesting decision making process between what blockers you have available versus what I'm attacking with. And there's times where you can just throw a little chump blocker in the way, just as a little meat shield. There's times where you're like, hey, I'm willing to trade creatures because I can kill your creature with mine. Or maybe there's a keyword that helps with killing the attacking creature or something like that. Or there may be times where you go, hey, I just got this big guy out. I want to attack with him next turn, so I'll take the damage so that I can keep him on the board. And so then you just kind of let it through, take the damage, and say, "Oh well, no big deal." And that's exactly how it works with planeswalkers as well, is that you can choose to block for them.
Yes.
And so it's a very interesting kind of dynamic where people are then attacking a planeswalker instead of your life total. So you kind of have this um, kind of a blocker for your life total, and it just costs you some mana to get them out. So
Yeah,
it's interesting.
yeah, and I think honestly, I think it's interesting to us because we played Yu-Gi-Oh. Yu-Gi-Oh is like our baseline. And in Yu-Gi-Oh, man, if they have a wall of creatures, we're like, dang, like I got to get through that. Or in Commander, they can have a wall of creatures, but you're like, I bet he won't block, and
Yep.
you can just get through. Uh,
Yep.
so for us, it is very fascinating. And onto the Planeswalker thing too. Bowser was telling me he puts some Planeswalkers in his 99, and he likes them obviously because they're good cards. But he also told
Yep.
me, he goes, sometimes he views them as another life bar. He's like, because they're
Yep.
gonna throw creatures at that planeswalker and not me, and so it's like a little extra life bar that just keeps me alive a little longer. And I was like, oh,
Yep.
that's like, it's a really interesting thought process.
That's
behind
interesting.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. That is really interesting. Well, and there's so many planeswalkers that if you have a dedicated strategy of okay, this is my deck, this is what I want to do, and Michael, your example earlier was my commander wants to draw a bunch of cards. So if you know that's your theme and that's what you're trying to do, I guarantee there's at least one or maybe two, maybe three planeswalkers that want to do that too.
Oh
And
yeah.
so it's really easy to find a planeswalker a lot of times for cheap that can do those things as well and kind of supplement your game plan even if they're not your commander. So yeah, they're cool. They're cool add-ins to the deck even if they're not the thing that you're building around.
Yeah. I actually, when I was first starting to play, I actually avoided using planeswalkers
Hmm.
for a long time because I was very new to the game, and planeswalkers are a nice addition, but it was almost like I don't need them in the deck because it
Yeah.
was like a whole. It's one of the few cards. It kind of adds a new rule dynamic. It's a new target to attack.
Yep.
They have their own abilities and rules. So I avoided using them for a long time just because I was new and I didn't really want to deal with it at the time. But
Yeah.
going into some pods, there were
Well,
people.
they can't do damage, so I can see that being a little. It can be a little tricky.
Yeah,
Here, I'm gonna run and take the dogs out real quick. Keep going.
yeah. So I'm gonna go into the stack a little bit. So kind of running back into gameplay. You're doing your turn. You're doing your untap, upkeep, draw. Kind of going into that back to that priority thing. So the stack, I really like how Magic does it. So the way the stack works is someone casts a creature. It's their spell. They want to cast a creature. So, like, you take a physical card and it's like, hey, I'm casting this. But then someone says, hey, I have a response. And they said, I'm going to pay my mana and I'm going to attempt to counterspell it. Well, now there's another card on the stack. And so it literally goes like this. And it's one of the reasons I really like Magic, that whenever interactions are happening and going on, you just kind of, you don't have to physically do this. You just kind of keep it in your mind. But by the time it all resolves, everyone's done responding and casting their stuff. You go, okay, what was the last thing on the stack? Oh, it was that counter spell. That resolves. Oh, I countered the creature. The creature was, countered. So the creature didn't make it. That's a very simple version of the stack. There's also other instances of the stack. It doesn't just go the cards, it's also abilities. So you can say, hey, tap this creature, lets me draw 2 cards, discard 2 cards. Well, somebody else can respond with their creature's ability or something to counteract that. They can even just respond just to say, hey, I'm going to respond by tapping this mana. All that goes on the stack and you just walk it backwards. It helps a lot of complicated sequences, especially in a 4-player game when everyone could have been doing something at the same time, just to walk it backwards and you're just taking one thing off the stack at a time. And another thing to note is as you're taking things off the stack and you're working back down, at any point during that stack, if someone else has a new response, so say something was countered, you go, okay, that resolved, but then this other thing was going to happen. Okay, well, because it was countered, I'm going to draw. Someone be like, hey, I'm going to respond to that resolution. And they're going to cast something. So a new card goes on the stack and then it will resume and walk backwards. The stack can get a little messy. It can get a little tricky. And my advice is go slow. And if you're in a pod where they're like talking real fast or doing things real fast, you can ask them like, hey, let me take a second. I don't understand what's going on. Can we please walk through this? Most of the time people say, okay. And they'll walk you through what's happening in that moment. And you can even say, hey, I want to respond to this. When can I respond to it? And they'll say, okay, well, this is going to happen first, then this. Now, if you would like to respond, this is when you can do it. And I think that is one of the beautiful things of Commander, is that you can slow the game down. You can have people walk you through what's happening. And that's what makes the stack so great, in my opinion. And that's a very light version of it. But the more you play, the easier it'll get. Don't be intimidated by it. Let's see. So we just walked through the stack. What else was there, Brandon?
So hearing the tail end of that explanation, I think that resolves. I think that's a very good explanation.
The stack resolves?
In Yu-Gi-Oh, it's yeah, exactly, of how it resolves and working backward. I think that's a good way to look at it. And it can seem a little complicated, and there's a few instances where you'll get into weird situations where you go, okay, hang on, this spell is duplicating this, but I'm trying to counterspell this. So am I counterspelling the copy, or am I counterspelling this, or am I counterspelling? And you just have to work through it, just talk it out with the table, and you guys will reach a conclusion. And so
Yep.
That's already happened several times, and I've only been playing for 2 months. And so you just work it out, you just talk it back, and a lot of times if you're not confident, it's okay to just kind of go to the more experienced players and say, hey, this is what I'm trying to do. Is this how this works? And just ask them. And a lot of times they're not going to hold that against you or anything like that. I've straight up showed people cards in my hand before and been like, hey, I'm not really sure which of these does this, but this is what I'm trying to do.
Yep.
And they're like, oh yeah, you need to use this card, and then you need to do this many, you need to pay this much in X or something like that. So I think overall that's it's really it's pretty straightforward. It can get very complicated very quickly, just because there's 90,000 cards in Magic, but it's really not that bad once you're actually playing. Just read your cards before you play. Make sure you know what your cards do, and you'll be fine.
Yeah, I think that's great. Yeah. I think I see on here we're mentioning some keywords. We went over them a little bit in card types. So I'm going to kind of group this together, I think.
Yeah.
So I'm going to start with card types. We'll start at the top. And again, very basic Magic the Gathering stuff, but different card types. Generically speaking, there's creatures, there are sorceries, instances, artifacts, enchantments, lands, and planeswalkers. Uh, there's a few more. I think there's like battles and there's some like dual face cards, but generically speaking, as far as card types go, those are the main ones. The ones you're going to see the most anyway. And then there are tokens. And tokens are like, if you played Yu-Gi-Oh, you know what a token is. It's a fake card. It's like an apparition that another card created. But they can be any of the other card types from what I'm aware of. I've never seen a planeswalker token. That doesn't mean they don't exist, but I've never seen one. For the most part, you're just going to see artifacts and creatures, from my experience. Occasionally enchantments. But for the most part, it's just creatures and tokens, or creatures and artifacts. And then that kind of falls into permanents. You might see some cards that say non-land permanent or destroy target permanent. And a permanent just means any card that is physically on the battlefield. So that's stays on the battlefield. So that's any land, creature, enchantment, or artifact or planeswalker. They're physically on the field.
Battle as well.
Battle as well. You don't see those as often, but yes. Sorceries and instances, they're just cast from your hand. They don't actually, hit the battlefield. They just resolve. Mm-hmm. So anything that says like a permanent, that's a permanent.
D&D, if you've ever played D&D, think like a cantrip, not a concentration spell.
Yeah, that's a great example. So it's so those are permanents. Pretty straightforward. And then, not to go too deep into this, but following up the permanents, card types, we're going to get into keywords. We already mentioned them a little bit, but a keyword is going to be in that white box just below where it says legendary creature or creature. And keywords are usually they're usually just on permanents. So and there's a bunch of keywords. I doubt I could list them all, but most of them will say hexproof, haste, first strike, double strike, vigilant. Those are just some generic ones.
Flying.
Yeah. And a lot of them will have, there's a lot, and a lot of them will have a definition next to them. And if you don't know what it is, one, you can just Google it and it'll just pop up. Two, you can just ask somebody and they'll tell you. But if it has something on there, that's a keyword. When somebody says, generically speaking, these are usually just on creatures. Most of the time, they just apply to creatures. Creatures are going to have the most keywords. But usually you might hear maybe other podcasts or the YouTubers, they're going to talk and it's going to be like, hey, this creature has evasion. Well, evasion is not an actual keyword. Evasion is more an all-encompassing term for keywords themselves, which means the creature has something that gives it evasion of some kind. So it could fly, it could be indestructible, it could have menace, it could have haste, skulk. Like, there's so many things. But basically, evasion means it can attack and it has something that makes it harder to block. It's like the best way to describe it. Or it makes you not want to block it. So that's when someone says, hey, this card has really good evasion. They're just saying it has some keywords on there that make it hard to block or hard to deal with. That's
Yeah.
basically keywords in a nutshell. There's a whole list of them, and some commanders are built around keywords. Like there's some commanders that are like, hey, I give everything death touch. I give everything double strike. So really do your homework on what your deck wants to do, cards that have keywords on them. Make sure you understand what it does, and make sure you know what's best for your strategy and your like what you're wanting to do. If you're like a big swing, want to do big damage, you're looking for like double strike, trample, indestructible maybe. But if you're more like aristocratic, you like just want to like ping, sit on the sidelines, like you might want more death touch. You might want, menace or skulk, like don't touch me, flying, things like that. So just like keep an eye out, and if you see a card that has a keyword on it that you don't know what it does, just ask. Like,
Ask or look it up.
Yeah, they're not going to lie to you because it's public knowledge. And,
Exactly.
And even if they try to lie to you, there's 2 other players on the board that are not going to really let that fly.
Yeah. Well, and kind of to tack onto that as well, I think it's totally fine to, if you're sitting there getting confused between what's the difference between indestructible, hexproof, ward, and shroud. Those are 4 that are all kind of similar. They all kind of do the same thing in different ways, and you can go, okay, hang on, I want to use lightning bolt on that creature. Can I do it or can I not? I think that's totally fine to ask, or to say, hey, can I target that? And they can say, hey, this has hexproof, so you can target it, but it's not going to work. Hey, this has ward, so you can target it, you can destroy it, but it's going to cost you 3 more mana, or whatever the ward count is. Hey, this has shroud, so you can't even target it. Something like that. Or hey, it has indestructible, so you can target it, but it's not going to die. And so I think that there's a lot of things like that I think it's totally okay to ask, give a use case, and just go ahead and let the table know. Yes, they're going to have knowledge of your hand. Yes, they're going to know, but at least you didn't waste the spell. At least you still have the card in hand.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's everything on this first section.
Yeah. One thing I do want to kind of add in on the tokens is tokens can be an entire deck type in the different categories. There are some decks that are completely dedicated to making treasure tokens or clue tokens or creature tokens, and just making 120 creature tokens and killing everybody in one turn.
Yep.
And so that is absolutely feasible, and there's a lot of decks that really benefit from having a small token package, or even just using creature tokens as blockers or something like that. There's a lot of removal spells that say, hey, destroy target non-land permanent and give them a small token, or counter a spell and give them a swan, and that kind of stuff. And so those cards are not necessarily bad. It means, yes, they have a blocker, yes, they have an attacker on their turn, but you got rid of something much worse in exchange for a basic card that doesn't have any other text on it. So,
and I think, stop me if I'm wrong, but I think you bring this up from our Yu-Gi-Oh, just our Yu-Gi-Oh background, because in Yu-Gi-Oh, this kind of goes along with it. So Yu-Gi-Oh, you only have 5 monster zones, and in Magic, there is no monster zone. There's unlimited amount of space. You just kind of organize.
Have 150 monsters.
Yeah. And so in Yu-Gi-Oh, we had tokens, but they weren't really anything.
Yeah, they're kind of bad.
They were kind of bad because it didn't. And Yu-Gi-Oh is just it's a different game entirely. But I think people coming from Yu-Gi-Oh to Magic, they may see token and shy away from it, when in Magic, like you said, you can have an entire strategy dedicated to tokens. I have a commander deck that's all tokens, and I love it. It's so much fun. So tokens in Magic are a very viable and a threatening presence on the battlefield.
Yep.
So don't shy away from them. It's just another type that there's not it's not really like a physical card in your deck. It just like creates something akin to it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I just won a game on Friday with a Scoot Swarm, which is it's kind of a nasty card in and of itself, but yeah, I had 126 tokens at the end on my turn, and I went, okay, well, these are all ready to go, and so once they were done being summoning sick, I just swung out, and it's like, yeah, they were all 1/1s. They were super easy to block or kill, but there was 126 of them, so you can't block that many of them, and so I just was able to swing out, and everybody was dead.
Yep.
So, yeah, it's going, and that's called going wide. And we'll talk more about strategies a little bit later, but
Yeah.
that is, you're going so wide that people can't possibly stop everything, and so, and it's interesting the things that tokens can do, because like treasure tokens give you more mana, clue tokens help you draw, creatures obviously can block or attack, that kind of stuff. There's just a lot of cool things that they have built in, and likewise, kind of going through the card types. Kind of, Mike, I think this would be kind of cool to give a brief description of the card types and kind of what they generally do.
The card types, like,
Yeah, of like artifact, enchantment, land,
oh yeah,
instant, sorcery, that kind of thing.
yeah. So obviously creatures are creatures. There's all kinds of subtypes next to them: humans, goblins, all kinds, all kinds. So those are, just think of like in Yu-Gi-Oh, they're your monsters, they're the creatures. And then you get to artifacts. People call these rocks a lot, which is a great kind of term for them. So they're like equipment. So there's artifact equipments are kind of a type. So where creatures have like their subtypes are like humans, goblins, artifacts are like equipment. And excuse me. Sorry, let me just grab a random one real quick. So most of the time they're just an artifact, so they're just a rock, or it'll have a subtype like an equipment. Sometimes, rarely, but sometimes you can have a creature that is also an artifact. There is overlap. You can have a creature that's also an enchantment. You can have, there's a little bit of overlap in Magic. Like you can have an artifact creature, an enchantment creature. Sometimes you can have all three if the cards are played correctly. But for the most part, artifacts are like the rocks or the equipment pieces. So they can give you mana. It maybe is a sword that's going to pump up your creature. It could even be something that's just like, hey, it's making things indestructible. Artifacts can kind of do a lot. They're kind of like, if you play D&D, they're kind of like a magic item. It's some physical thing that has some magical ability attached to it, whether that is a weapon, piece of armor, or it's just an obelisk that's just there.
Yeah.
Then you get into enchantments. I'm going through the permanents right now. Enchantments are, in my mind, enchantments are like field spells in Yu-Gi-Oh! They're a blanket effect that, depending on their effect, affects just you. Sometimes they affect the entire board. Just kind of depends on what the ability is of the enchantment. But they're just kind of like an overall blanket effect, usually for something. Then sorceries and instances, kind of like how you said earlier, D&D terms, these are your spells, like you're casting a spell. Sometimes they're cantrips. They're just little 1 mana, pay 1, draw a card. Sometimes they're big sorceries that are like, hey, pay 7 mana, destroy all creatures. Like I'm doing one big spell. And enchantments in that sense are probably more like your concentration spells. Like they're just always up. And you only have to cast them once, which is great. And sometimes they all have different abilities and things like that. I'm not going to get super deep into them. Then obviously you have your lands. Lands can have abilities too. And what else am I missing? We talked about planeswalkers already, instant sorcerers, battles. I'll touch on battles because we've talked about them a little bit. So battles are They're their own thing. They came out in a set last year. They can be fun. I'm not trying not to like shit talk them at all. They're just not. I just don't
Yeah.
see them a lot. But basically, they come out and you say, "I'm going to cast this battle," and it's a two-sided card. So you cast it on one side. That's the battle. Usually has some effect for you of like gain 3 life, draw a card, and then it has a little defense counter of like 4, and kind of the same as a planeswalker. Uh, you cast your battle and you hand it to a player to defend it. So you're like, "Hey, I'm going to give you this," and then anybody can, but basically you can attack the battle instead of a player. You can be like, "Hey, I'm going to send this creature to attack that battle," and defending player can choose to defend it or not. And once you've depleted the defense points on it, so say one has 4, you swung at it for 4, they're like, "Hey, I'm not going to block." Then you beat the battle, it comes back to your side, you flip it over, and on the other side has some benefit to you, the player. And that's either some creature, enchantment, it could be an artifact, it could be anything. Usually it's always a permanent, but it has some benefit to you defeating the battle and you get what's on the other side. You don't
Mm.
see them very often, wouldn't really worry about them a whole bunch, but they do exist. They are fun. Yeah.
Do you mind
Anything?
if I add a couple of like quick items
Yeah,
to
absolutely.
these?
Absolutely. Please do.
Yeah. So one of the instants and sorceries are the two non-permanent types. The biggest difference between them is that sorceries can only be done on your turn. Instants can be done at any time. So there's a lot of instants that are counter counter target spell or destroy target creature or some kind of interaction or maybe protection. Hey, my creatures gain indestructible, and so you may not need that on your turn, but you can use it on your turn. But maybe that's better on your opponent's turn. Whereas sorceries can be a little bit more powerful, where they may have the effects of destroy all creatures on the field and something like that. So they may have much more blanket, much more powerful effects. Some of them are search your library for two basic lands and put them onto the field tapped. So that is a way to get around your one land per turn way thing, which is great and fantastic. And some sorceries are destroy all monsters, and some sorceries are get stuff out of your graveyard. So sorceries can do all kinds of crazy stuff, and are integral to basically every deck that exists. Instants are more interaction, and it's more stuff that you're going to want to do on your opponent's turn, and maybe it's protecting your board, maybe it's attacking other people, maybe it's a little bit of both, and so it really just kind of depends there, and that's kind of what's cool about about those anyway, is that they kind of have that restriction of your turn versus any time. Um, Lands do, Michael, you mentioned this, that lands have additional effects. Some of the best cards in the game are there's a card called Rogue's Passage, and this is a very specific card, but you can basically pay mana to make a creature that you control unblockable, and that is bananas. That is insanely good, because that's like the best form of evasion that you can possibly have. And so for commander damage, that's amazing. For all kinds of stuff, that's amazing. It's a cheap card. You can get it with all kinds of different printings on it, but you can also just use it as a regular land and tap for colorless mana. So it's really good. That kind of stuff is what's called like a utility land, where it has an additional effect, but it's not necessarily giving you the color of mana that you need to maybe cast your commander, or to cast an instant or a sorcery that you need to cast or something like that. But it is still useful. Um, the You kind of mentioned the enchantments being a blanket effect. I absolutely agree with that. And using the example of a field spell, I think that's perfect. There's a few enchantments that you can enchant target creature, and pump them up. There's a few of them that are enchant target creature and it loses some power, or something like that. And so
Those are
give
called
them a poisoned
auras.
apple or yes, and those are enchantment auras. auras. Yes, yeah, well said. I sorry, the name was slipping
No,
me.
you're good. So like
Um,
the artifacts have like the equipment subtype. The aura is a subtype of enchantments.
yes, yes, that's perfect. And so, and that's kind of the cool part about enchantments and artifacts is because they are a permanent type. Even if the creature that enchanted them, or that they were enchanted by, or if you had an artifact that was an equipment, like a cool sword or something, um, if the creature that it was equipped to dies, it's okay. Like that stays on the field. You can just pay the equip cost and equip it to something else. And so I mentioned boots much earlier in this episode. Boots are some of the best cards in the game. There's like 6 of them now, and boots are insane. They're just absolutely bananas. Every single one of them is just insane. So, and that's really, really good to just be able to go, okay, get out my boots, pay the equip cost. Now this thing it has haste and indestructible, or it has haste and,
Hexproof.
ward 4 or
Yeah.
whatever. Yeah, exactly. So the boots are absolutely crazy, and most decks are going to run at least one boots, maybe two. Just kind of depends on them. So there's a huge variety of the different artifacts. If you go buy a precon, it's going to come with Soul Ring, which is a one cost artifact that taps for two. And that's insane. If you get that turn one, you're immediately ahead, because you can just play a normal land, play Soul Ring, and you now have 3 mana next turn, and everybody else has one. So that's just crazy, and that's what we call RAM. We'll talk about that a little bit later on as well. But yeah, the subtypes of all these cards can go very deep, and as Mike alluded to, there's several of them that kind of overlap, and there's several of them that can do different things. But yeah, that's there's a lot of cool resources for finding cards that do different things that you're trying to do. And a lot of times, searching by text or keyword is a way to kind of find those cards that do the things that you want to do.
Yeah. And I think I was just realizing too, like a lot of the stuff we've talked about today has been like there's a reason that there's so many different channels and people talk about this stuff. Like you can break each one of these things down into individual discussions. I mean, even mulligans can be a
Absolutely.
discussion. Uh,
Yeah,
the different
absolutely.
card types, the permanents. But at the end of this, just trying to reiterate, like this is just to kind of give you a very brief overview and general understanding. And I feel like we've rambled a little bit and kind of jumped around some, but hopefully you're still able to kind of keep pace with what's happening and what's going on. And these are just all the things we're talking about. These are just kind of like the rules of the game, the card types, just kind of some generic keywords you might find on creatures, um, types of cards you're going to see. All that is just to kind of fill your head with kind of that baseline knowledge. And if you're already in Magic on some level, you already know 90% of this. I think the main takeaway between what we've talked about and Commander is, I think the main takeaways at the end of this is Commander is a 4-player multiplayer game. You'll draw on your first turn, and we'll get into it a little bit later, but you can talk with your opponent. You can politic a little bit. And that's where you get into the whole priority. There's a reason there's that priority circle of how going from one person to the next. Um, I think those are kind of the big takeaways because everything else after that is kind of very much the same. All the other things, the permanence, the you know land types, abilities, all that you'll find in Magic the Gathering, no matter what format you're going to be in.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
I totally agree. That social aspect has actually been one of my favorite parts. Is that, and we have this on kind of a future bullet point down here, so we'll probably get to that a little later. But that's been one of my favorite parts, is the fact that there is a lot of politicking. There's a lot of discussion that happens at the table where maybe you're a turn behind, or maybe you missed a land drop or something, and so you can kind of maybe make a deal with the person who's been, maybe they've been attacking you, or maybe it looks like they're going to attack you, and so you can say, hey, I need a turn to kind of get my stuff together. If you'll give me a turn of no attacking, then I will help you remove that creature over there that's going to cause you problems. And you can kind of make deals, or you can kind of make little temporary alliances. And we'll kind of talk a little bit more about how to do that and how to do that well, and how to kind of lawyer it up a little bit. And
Yeah.
I say that in quotations, obviously. Mike was a really good teacher in that, and our friend Bowser did a really good job of helping me learn a little bit more about, like, hey, put an expiration date on your deals because you don't want to play the whole game not being able to attack somebody. So
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of really cool stuff that you can do with that.
Yeah. And honestly, looking through all this, I think I want to save the deck building and playing the game for another, because I mean we talked for an hour on just kind of generic
Yeah,
rules,
absolutely.
and I don't want to like overwhelm anybody, which I'm sure they already are. It's a lot to take in, but feel
Yeah.
free to go back, re-listen to kind of what we said earlier. Um, Again, this was all very generic. This was even baseline how to play Magic the Gathering to an effect. I think it was definitely catering towards people that come from other strategic card games or tabletop card games, uh, TCGs, whatever you call them, trading card games. That's what I was trying to think of.
Yep. You had it.
Yeah, I
You
was
had it.
there. I was there. Um,
You were there. You had it.
but yeah, I think hopefully this can kind of get your mind going a little bit. Obviously, um, I mean, you know this, but find other sources of information too. Like, this is just to get you started, but like, there's a ton of stuff out there. Read up on it, watch more videos. Hopefully, this piqued someone's interest and at least gave them a little more confidence to kind of jump into it. Um, but if you need a place to start, honestly, Magic the Gathering Arena will teach you how to play the game. It's not Commander. I don't think I said that earlier. It's actually one of the other formats called Standard, but it'll at least teach you a lot of what we discussed today as far as
Hmm.
mulligans, uh, card types, mana, land tokens, all that fun stuff. I think is all on that app, and that is a fantastic place to start, in my opinion, especially if you're
Hmm.
brand new to this. So, do
Yeah,
you have anything you want to add?
definitely. I think that was extremely well said, and I actually really like that we got kind of granular on some of the like rulings and some of the more specific things. I know there's some stuff that's like you kind of learn as you play, but like knowing, hey, you play one mana a turn, and that's how you get your mana, or your land per turn, and that's how you get your mana. I'm sorry if that's not what I said, but it's stuff like that, and knowing, hey, you have 100 cards in your deck. One is your commander. You start with seven. You draw one. Some of that stuff that I had to look up because it wasn't explicitly said anywhere, until I literally had to look up the rule book, and so. That kind of stuff I think is really useful, and I think it's cool to have all that information in one place. Do you mind if I do like a preview and kind of like a little snippet of what's to come?
No, please go ahead.
Okay. So, like we mentioned, Mike and I have quite a bit of experience building decks. He has a year in Commander. I've only got a couple months, but like we said earlier, we've got several years, probably over a decade in other games. And I play a lot of other shuffle builders, other deck builders, just on the side for fun, like Dominion, like Smash Up, different things like that. I love card games just in general. And so, one of the things that we're going to kind of talk about next is going to be going a little bit more into deck building and some of our philosophies, some of the things we like and don't like. Our friend Bowser definitely influenced both of us quite a bit on how we deck build and what kind of stuff we look for, that sort of thing. But I think we both kind of bring our own philosophies to it. So that's something we kind of want to go through is some good resources, some advantages and disadvantages to the colors and kind of what they do. We did kind of want to share some of the resources that we have found, kind of talk about some of the ways to build a deck. Either you're starting in pre-con or you're doing a custom, different things like that. Talk about budget a little bit, and even like how to look at, okay, what cards are worth spending a little bit of money on, and maybe even looking at the proxy argument a little bit. I don't think there's much of an argument to be had. Printing is totally legal and fine. You just kind of have to make sure your pod's fine with it. But I think that's something to discuss and something to just kind of talk about a little bit more in podcast form. And then one of the other discussions that we may save for another episode is actually playing the game. What does the first couple of turns look like? What are common terms you'll hear in Commander? How long does a game take? What are alternate win cons? Different things like that, and kind of going in a little bit more into like, hey, you're going to your first game night. You're going alone. What does that look like? There's no reason to be nervous, but what do you expect? That kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
I know it was definitely a little bit nerve wracking for me to go to my first LGS, my first local game store by myself. And so we can kind of share some of our experiences and kind of share strategies for approaching other pods, and kind of getting involved. Just different things like that. So um, this is all Commander 101. We've actually got notes and scripts written out for Commander 201 and even 301. And we can link all of our resources as well so that you guys can check some of these videos or some of these things out as well. Maybe watch a couple of games yourselves. So, but that's all I had.
Yeah. So I hope you guys got something useful out of it. I know it's always a pleasure talking with you, Brandon, and just talking
Of
about
course,
games we love
always
and
a pleasure.
what we do. So yeah, this was really
Yeah,
fun. So I think
it's a blast.
that's all I have for today. But
Perfect.
yeah, well, thank you all for joining us, for those who watched. And we're definitely going to do this again. I don't know when, but once it's up, be sure to subscribe and we'll let you know. So, till then,
Bring that bail.
ta ta for now.